The time has come for us to consider the reopening of churches, and I'm so glad you've joined me to watch this presentation. Under the current conditions, which have improved recently, the Cape Conference is now encouraging the local churches to reopen, subject to compliance with the relevant regulations and requirements. As you may remember, a while ago, the conference was discouraging the reopening of churches. But now, because conditions have improved, the conference is encouraging that churches reopen and that we adhere to the government regulations in this regard. Now, the regulations for church services are found primarily in the Government Gazette number 43365, dated the 28th of May 2020. We have shared this on various WhatsApp groups, and I encourage you to read through them. If you would like a copy, you're welcome to contact me and I can send it to you. As the local churches, through their church boards and their COVID-19 compliance committees, consider these matters for the reopening of the churches, I thought I would put together this video to prepare you for the reopening of churches in our area, that you can catch a view of what this new normal would be like for now. In this presentation, I would like to look at four things: the leadership, preparation, and most of the time will be spent on regulations pertaining to a church service and also considering some implications of that. So when we consider leadership, in this context, each local church needs to appoint a COVID-19 compliance committee, which works under the direction of the board and which is the team responsible for ensuring the necessary preparations and measures are put in place to reopen the church responsibly. And I would suggest that you also evaluate the situation to see how things are working and if the objectives are being reached. Now, the local district also has a COVID-19 compliance committee, and the district compliance committee is there to assist the local church in preparing to reopen. Pastors, elders, and officers also will play a role and must ensure compliance with the relevant government regulations. And in this note, I would encourage all worshippers, whether you're a member or a visitor of a local church, to work together with your church leaders to support them, and together we can make it as easy as possible for one another. Also, something new is that each local church would need a health and safety officer. Now, a health and safety officer is also to be appointed for each local church, as I mentioned, and needs to be on site at each service, and who is empowered or is to be empowered to refuse entrance or to remove or to isolate any worshipper with symptoms of COVID-19 as the situation demands. And I'll share a little bit later on what those symptoms are. So let's look at some preparations before we get into what a church service would look like under these regulations. Let's look at a plan, a well-documented plan covering all details related to the government regulation needs to be put in place and put together by the COVID-19 Compliance Committee, the local church COVID-19 Compliance Committee, and presented to and be accepted by the church board. This plan will ensure that all necessary preparations and mechanisms are in place to reopen the church responsibly. And the conference has helped us a great deal in this regard with a long checklist of things that need to be included in our plan. There's also an occupancy certificate that is needed. And here's an example on the screen. The church would need to ensure that the COVID-19 occupancy compliance certificate, which includes indication of the full capacity of the venue, the number of full capacity, and then also the number for 50% capacity of the venue. As you may know, no church is allowed to exceed 50% capacity of the venue if they can keep the 1.5 meter social distancing requirement as well. In my estimation, um, churches wouldn't get near the 50% mark after complying with the 1.5-meter social distancing requirement. I estimate it would be more like 30% of the venue's capacity. Well, this compliance certificate needs to be authorized by the church board and displayed in the church. Running water is also something that the church needs to ensure that there is on the premises, and in the East London district, we have no challenges in that regard. Let's look at the regulations pertaining to the church services themselves. And I would like to share these regulations and directives in order to help church officers, members, and visitors to form a realistic picture of what it will be like worshiping together once again. And I would like this picture to be formed in your mind prior to the actual first service that you may attend. That you have a picture of what it would be like. So let's look at this. There's a number of categories, and I've used headings or part of headings that are found in the regulation themselves. So under phased reopening of worship services or places of worship, no more than 50% of the capacity of the venue is currently allowed, up to a maximum of 250 people. So if your church could take 500 people, the maximum capacity is 250 people. Virtual worship services and programs should also be provided where practicable under the regulation. And in this regard, the East London District is providing a weekly worship service or different programs, as well as the conference, which are helpful in this regard. The maximum duration of a service is 2 hours. Multiple services can be held, but a 30-minute gap between services is required to sanitize the venue and prepare the venue for the next service. But each service is not allowed to go longer than 2 hours. Let's look at some health and safety measures. A plan needs to be in place to ensure that the limitation on the number of persons is adhered to. And each local church COVID-19 compliance committee with the board will need to consider how best to manage the numbers that are in attendance. Screening also needs to be conducted prior to persons entering the place of worship. Now, the screening includes taking the temperature of the person, which should not exceed a maximum of 37.0 degrees Celsius, and the worshipper also needs to indicate if he or she has experienced any of the following symptoms in the last 24 hours: fever, cough, sore throat, shortness of breath, difficulty in breathing, body aches, loss of smell or taste, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, weakness, or tiredness. Importantly, if a person's temperature is over 37 degrees Celsius, or if they have experienced any of the listed symptoms in the last 24 hours, they will not be allowed entrance into the church. Also, a plan needs to be in place. Before I read this, let's say someone develops symptoms while they are in the worship service. And a plan needs to be in place to isolate any person who presents with symptoms, as well as to provide safe transportation for that person where practicable to get examined and tested. This person would also need to indicate whom he or she has had contact with at the place of worship for contact tracing. Where a person presented with symptoms, the risk of transmission would need to be assessed, the area where the person was needs to be disinfected, and an approach would need to be followed that would not put people at further risk. And I think the health and safety officer would be a key person in this regard. If the person that presented with symptoms tests positive for COVID-19 after being tested, he or she would need to inform the health and safety officer and indicate his or her attendance at any worship services 14 days prior to testing positive. And again, I believe this is for contact tracing purposes. Then let's look at social distancing. No physical contact is allowed between persons at the place of worship. So no handshaking, no hugging, etc. 1.5 meters of social distancing should be maintained at all times between worshippers. Also, there's no congregational singing that will be allowed. Only solos or pre-recorded music is allowed. So a solo special item is allowed, or pre-recorded music. If the preacher or the soloist needs to remove his or her mask to preach or to sing, he or she may do so without a mask, but would then need to stand at least 2.5 meters from any other person. Let's look at personal protection. The same principle applies in the church: no mask, no entry. And no worshipper is to remove his or her mask during the service and should keep the mask on for the duration of the whole service. Since there is to be no physical contact between worshippers, baptism, foot washing, and ordination will not be permitted or conducted at this time. Those counting tithes and offerings, for example, the deacons, treasurers, need to sanitize well before, during, and after doing so, and should remember not to touch their faces as they do this counting. Let's consider sanitizers, disinfectants, and other measures. Now, hand sanitizers are to be available at the entrance of the church as well as in the church as well. More than that, facilities of soap and water for the washing of hands is required as well. All surfaces, equipment, furniture, and common objects are to be sanitized before the service, as well as after the service in preparation for the next service. As required, toilets, common areas, door handles, electronic equipment, and objects need to be sanitized as regularly as possible, even during the service, if that is necessary. No sharing of equipment, objects, Bibles, hymnals, lesson study books, etc. is allowed. Let's consider the health protocols. Seating arrangements in the church should reflect the social distancing requirement of 1.5 meters between persons. An attendance register of all worshippers needs to be taken, indicating full names, residential address, cell phone number, telephone number, or email address, and the contact details of persons living in the same residence. All that information will be included in the attendance register. All attendees should be informed of the dangers of COVID-19 and on how to prevent its transmission. Social activities are not permitted before or after the worship service. So after the worship services, people would need to proceed on home. No substances or liquids may be shared between worshippers during a worship service. So no eating or no shared eating and drinking would be permitted. Worshippers over 60 years of age or those with comorbidities are encouraged to continue worshipping at home. Let's look at some of these implications. These are some implications that came to my mind. Ministering to persons over 60 and persons with comorbidities. Since those over 60 years of age and those with comorbidities are encouraged to continue worshipping at home, local churches and districts should seek still to minister to these persons in other ways to make sure that they are catered for. And the conference programs can also assist us in this regard. But we need to keep in mind that they still need our ministry. Virtual services. While churches are encouraged to reopen, we should still try to provide virtual services where possible. Not everyone will be able to attend. The size of the venue also has an impact on that, the age, those with comorbidities, and we should try to continue ministering to people in the virtual space. An important implication is to note that you must stay home if you have symptoms. Don't even come to church if you have any of the symptoms listed on the screen. a fever, a cough, a sore throat, shortness of breath, difficulty in breathing, body aches, loss of smell or taste, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, fatigue, weakness, or tiredness. If you've experienced any of these in the last 24 hours prior to a worship service, you'll need to stay at home because you won't be permitted to enter into the church. Or if you have a temperature currently that's over 37 degrees Celsius, please rather stay at home because you'd also not be permitted to enter. Limitation on numbers. In light of the 1.5 meter social distancing requirement and the 50% venue capacity requirement, local churches may not be able to minister to all of their members at one time. So as a result, churches would need to consider other creative means of ministering to all members. For example, maybe they'll live stream the church service so others can join them online. They could have more than one service. They could make use of small groups. They could put the services on DVDs. They could record the services, put them on DVDs for the elderly. The church would need to consider how best to approach that. Also, booking for church services. Each local church would need to consider how best to approach the attendance of worshippers at the church services. A local booking system may need to be instituted where members or visitors can book prior to the service, up to the available number of persons allowed into the place of worship and subject to those 1.5 meter social distancing requirements. So the church would need to work out how best to go about that. Also, a limitation on time. In light of the 2-hour limit on church services, each local church would need to consider how best to use those 2 hours. One possibility is to have a combined family-friendly service where both children and adults are catered for in one service. This would be much easier to manage than having different parts of the services going on at the same time. And lastly, realistic expectations and compliant participation. It is important that each worshipper, as far as possible, understands the current regulations and is willing to comply with them in order for everyone to be on the same page when the church reopens. And this is the purpose of this video, to give you a glimpse and understanding of what worshiping together will look like, the new normal for now. And I encourage you to support your leaders as they seek to apply these regulations, and pray for us and encourage us as we do this work. I would like to end off on this note. Together we can make it work. Yes, it is not what we desire, it is not ideal, but by God's grace we can make it work to fellowship and further God's cause. So may God bless you as you consider returning to church, as your churches will be reopening. They won't reopen at the same time, but when they do, may God bless you as we continue our fellowship together.